Tuesday of the 4th week in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the 2nd book of Samuel. Absalom unexpectedly came up against David's servants. He was mounted on a mule, and as the mule passed under the branches of a large terebinth, his hair caught fast in the tree. He hung between heaven and earth, while the mule he had been riding ran off. Someone saw this and reported to Joab that he had seen Absalom hanging from a terebinth. And taking 3 pikes in hand, he thrust for the heart of Absalom, still hanging from the tree alive. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and a lookout went up to the roof of the gate above the city wall, where he looked about and saw a man running all alone. The lookout shouted to inform the king, who said, "If he is alone, he has good news to report." The king said, "Step aside and remain in attendance here." So he stepped aside and remained there. When the Cushite messenger came in, he said, "Let my lord the king receive the good news, that this day the Lord has taken your part, freeing you from the grasp of all who rebelled against you." But the king asked the Cushite, "Is young Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rebel against you with evil intent be as that young man." The king was shaken and went up to the room over the city gate to weep. He said as he wept, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom, and that day's victory was turned into mourning for the whole army when they heard that the king was grieving for his son. The word of the Lord.
The responsorial psalm. The response is, "Listen, Lord, and answer me." Incline your ear, O Lord, answer me, for I am afflicted and poor. Keep my life, for I am devoted to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Listen, Lord, and answer me. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for to you I call all the day. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. Listen, Lord, and answer me. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in kindness to all who call upon you. Hearken, O Lord, to my prayer, and attend to the sound of my pleading. Listen, Lord, and answer me.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. And the woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
The first reading comes from 2 Samuel 18, 9-10, 14b, 24-25a, and 36-19:3. Absalom has rebelled against David, and David had to flee out into the desert. But now David's troops have fought a battle against Absalom's, and they defeated them. Absalom tries to run away. His hair gets stuck in the low-lying branches of a terebinth, and he's stuck between heaven and earth. Now David has given very strict orders that Absalom was not to be harmed. But Joab, who is the general, is not exactly a genteel person, so he puts Absalom to death. When David hears about this, he forgets all about the victory and he mourns his son. And it's one of the most pathetic passages in the Bible. All he says is, "My son Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son." Over and over again. He's fixated on the lamentation that he does over his own son. Now Joab is angry because David in effect turned a day of joy, of victory, into a day of mourning. But again, maybe that's something that we should consider. That even when our enemies are harmed, they're still children of God. They're still people who should be loved. Maybe we should mourn the death of the victim and the death of the perpetrator as well, because they're all children of God, and somehow God is crying his eyes out over their death. The Gospel is from Mark 5, 21-43. Remember, in the ancient world there are three types of miracles: nature miracles, exorcisms, and healings. We heard a nature miracle last Saturday. Jesus calmed the sea. Yesterday we heard an exorcism. Legion was removed from that man. Today we hear about a healing. In fact, there are two healings: a small healing, the woman with a hemorrhage, and a large healing, the daughter of Jairus is raised from the dead. Jesus is told that the daughter of Jairus is dying, so he's on his way to do something about it. On his way, a woman with a hemorrhage. Now this is probably the menstrual flow. Remember, that would make a woman unclean, so she suffered from this for 14 years. She's been excluded from praying in the synagogue, from eating with her own family for 14 years. She touches Jesus, which is something she should not have done, because technically that has made him impure, but instead it heals her. And in fact, Jesus will say that your faith has saved you. Notice he doesn't say your faith has healed you. He said has saved you. In the Gospels, when there is simply a healing, no expression of faith, Jesus says heal. When there's an expression of faith, he will say save, because the person is healed not only physically, but also spiritually. When the woman touches Jesus, he feels power go out of him. It's a very primitive way of saying it. It almost sounds like the shock that one gets with a static electricity. But the idea is that it's not so much Jesus' authority that has healed her, but her faith. She is healed, and Jesus looks around in the crowd to see who touched him. Now, the disciples think that's crazy because everybody's touching him. It's kind of like being on the subway in Rome. One time I counted 13 people touching me at the same time. Most of them by accident, but not all of them. Well, many people touched him. Notice Jesus doesn't seem to know who touched him. It's the woman who has to identify herself. Luke is embarrassed by that because that doesn't show the authority of Jesus. So Luke has Jesus turn around to look at the woman who touched him. Mark, who says it just the way it happened, has Jesus a little confused, looking around. The woman identifies herself. Remember, Mark always presents Jesus dirty and dusty on the road, a very human Jesus. While in Luke, you get a Jesus who's a philosopher. In John, Jesus who's the only begotten Son of God. Well, Jesus arrives at the house of Jairus, and there are people playing the flutes and mourning. These are probably paid mourners because Jairus, being a synagogue leader, has to have a good funeral for his daughter. When Jesus says the girl's only sleeping, they laugh. So notice how little they're emotionally involved in her death. Jesus goes in, taking Peter, James, and John, the three apostles whom he always takes upon important events. Says, little girl, get up, and she gets up. And he says, give her something to eat. Notice Jesus raises her from the dead. That is not a resurrection as such, it's a reanimation. The only person to resurrect in the Gospels is Jesus. The daughter of Jairus, the son of the widow of Nain, Lazarus, they're all reanimated. They don't have glorified bodies. When they come back to life, they will die again someday. And notice the very human gesture. Give her something to eat. That she has been asleep, now she's hungry. Nourish her. That when Jesus comes into our life, he comes not only in supernatural, very powerful ways, but also in the everyday things, the everyday gifts of life that God gives us. And may God bless us.